The city below was a sprawling galaxy of dormant lights, a metropolis shrouded in a profound quiet. But high above it, in the penthouse of Julian Vance, a single light burned like a defiant star. It was well past 2 in the morning, and the CEO of the nation's most formidable tech empire prowled the confines of his study, a cold fire of frustration gnawing at him. The launch of Odyssey, his magnum opus, a project valued at a staggering $200 million, was dead in the water. For weeks, the system had been plagued by a ghost-like malfunction, and no one could exorcise it. His entire army of engineers, celebrated consultants, and the most expensive contractors' money could buy it all failed. Their collective genius had shattered against a wall of digital silence. The clock was ticking, and his legendary patience had worn dangerously thin. Drawn by a thirst he couldn't quench, Julian moved through the silent kitchen, his reflection a passing shadow on the dark marble. As his hand reached for the obsidian coffee pot, a sound pierced the stillness. It wasn't a bang or a crash, but something far more alien in the dead of night. A soft, impossibly fast staccato, a rhythmic, ghostly clicking. He froze, every nerve on high alert. It was a distinct sound of someone typing. He turned, his focus narrowed, following the sound as it grew more insistent, leading him back toward the one place no one else should be, his study. No one was permitted in his sanctuary, especially not at this hour. He shouldered the heavy oak door inward, and the sight before him stole his breath. There, bathed in the cold blue light of his command center, was Elara, the new maid, young, with blonde hair that seemed to absorb the light. She was a girl who was meant to be invisible, to move through the rooms like a whisper. He'd hired her less than a fortnight ago. Now, she was seated in his leather throne, her body leaning forward, eyes wide and luminous, locked onto screen where cascading lines of code flowed beneath her fingertips with speed that defied belief. What in God's name are you doing? Julian's voice wasn't a shout, but a blade that cut through the silence, honed by disbelief and fury. Elara recoiled as if struck, her hands shooting back from the keyboard as if it were white-hot. The architect of digital symphonies vanished, replaced by a terrified young woman, cornered and exposed. "Mr. Vance, I am so sorry," she stammered, her voice a frantic whisper as she scrambled away from the chair. I didn't mean any harm." "That terminal is off limits," Julian stated, his voice a low growl as he closed the distance between them. His expression was a mask of cold authority. "You are not to touch it." "I know, and I am truly sorry, Mr. Vance," Elara said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I was just polishing the desk and I saw an anomaly in the data stream. A recursion loop that didn't make sense. I wasn't trying to interfere." Annoyed, Julian leaned over the monitor, prepared to dismiss whatever triviality had caught her eye, until the code itself registered. He stopped cold. The very section she had altered was the heart of the labyrinth that had trapped his entire team for weeks. But where there had been a tangled mess of broken logic, there was now elegance. In what could have only been a few minutes, she had not just patched the error, she had completely re-engineered the function. It was cleaner, faster, more brilliant than the original concept. His own fingers, hesitant at first, moved over the keyboard, running diagnostics, tracing her logic. It was flawless, not just a fix, but a reinvention. It was digital poetry. His mind struggled to process the impossibility. "How?" The word was sharp, almost an accusation. "How did you even comprehend what you were looking at?" "I studied computer science," Elara said, her gaze fixed on the polished floor. "For a while, I had to drop out." Julian stared at her, the gears in his head turning furiously. "Where?" he demanded. "MIT," she breathed, the name of the prestigious institution a stark contrast to her simple maid's uniform. "But I never finished. My mother fell ill. We lost everything. I took the work I could get." There was no self-pity in her voice, only the flat, hard truth of a life derailed. Julian looked at her then, truly saw her, and the image before him fractured. This wasn't a maid who had stumbled upon a solution. This was a genius, his army of hand-picked, six-figure engineers had failed to see. And she had done it silently, for nothing. Elara stood there, twisting her hands together. A portrait of anxiety. "I know I overstepped, sir. I'll pack my things. I'm sorry." But Julian didn't hear her. His eyes were still glued to the screen, to her perfect, impossible solution. "You rewrote the entire authentication handshake," he said, his voice a low murmur of disbelief. "That single flawed function was a leak that was costing us millions with each passing day." Elara shifted on her feet, looking even more distressed. I just adjusted a few parameters. I promise I didn't mean to touch anything vital. Julian let out a slow, deliberate breath and finally turned to face her, the anger gone, replaced by an expression she couldn't decipher. Elara, he said, his voice low and intense. What you just touched was a catastrophic failure that was about to sink a $200 million project. You didn't just touch it. Her eyes widened in shock. You saved it. I did. The question was a faint whisper, her mind still catching up to the magnitude of his statement. Julian gave a single, sharp nod, his own shock still settling. I'm so sorry, she said again, the apology an ingrained reflex. Don't, he cut her off, the word sharp but not unkind. Do not apologize for being brilliant. Elara blinked, silenced by the command. He stepped back from the desk, dragging a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time that night. The air in the study, once thick with his frustration, now crackled with a different kind of energy. The volatile charge of discovery. The power dynamic had been shattered and reformed in a matter of minutes. After a long pause, his gaze found hers again. You're more than this, he said, the statement a quiet certainty. A fragile, sad smile touched Elara's lips. Right now, sir, this is all I am. Julian's expression hardened with determination. That, he said, his eyes locking onto hers, is about to change. And with that, he turned and strode out of the room, leaving her alone with a silent, glowing screen. His mind was a storm of calculations, but one thought rose above the chaos. He had just found a unicorn, and he had no intention of letting it go. Julian Vance had built his empire on his almost predatory ability to read people. He could dissect a person's entire character in a handshake, spotting the arrogance disguised as confidence, the mediocrity hiding behind prestigious degree. But Elara Finch, as he would soon learn her name was an enigma wrapped in a paradox. The next morning, while the city hummed its usual tune of commerce and ambition, Julian sat in his office, reviewing the thin file his assistant had compiled. The document read like a ghost story. There was no degree, no certifications, just a bleak trail of short-term jobs. Waitress, retail clerk, janitor. Her current employment was a part-time contract with a domestic staffing agency. She lived in a cramped apartment in a sector of the city his chauffeur was programmed to avoid. But then, one detail blazed from the page like a distress flare, a record of enrollment at MIT Computer Science. Top 10% of her class. And then a single sterile entry 2 years in. Withdrawn. Reason not stated. It was as if her entire future had simply fallen off a cliff. Later that evening, he found her on the grand marble staircase outside his study, meticulously wiping the railings. She moved with an unconscious economy of motion, a quiet efficiency that spoke of an intellect that optimized everything it touched, even the removal of dust. This kind of work, he began, his voice casual but precise. How long have you been doing it? Elara looked up, her hand freezing on the polished railing. The surprise of seeing him there, waiting, was evident on her face. Cleaning, sir? A few years, on and off. And before that, he pressed gently, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous hall. She paused, her gaze dropping for a second before meeting his again. A small, sad smile played on her lips. School. What happened? He asked, already knowing part of the answer but wanted to hear her version. She hesitated, the story clearly one she didn't like to tell. Life, she said simply. My father made some catastrophic investments. We lost everything. My mother's health began to fail under the stress. The bills, they were relentless. I left school to help. He nodded, his expression unreadable. MIT, he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. Her eyes widened, a flicker of alarm crossing her features. You looked me up. I don't allow anomalies in my system, Elara, he replied, his tone level and devoid of apology. You are the biggest anomaly I've encountered in a decade. She gave a soft, resigned laugh that held no humor. That person feels like she belongs to another lifetime. Julian studied her face, the harsh light of the chandelier catching the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes. She wasn't bitter or resentful. She was just tired, with a profound weariness of mind built for soaring, trapped in a cage of circumstance. That night, long after she had gone, Julian laid a trap. He took a development folder from a junior analyst team, a project involving complex data sorting, and placed it on his desk. But before he did, he inserted a subtle flaw, a logical paradox hidden deep within a recursive function. It was a Gordian knot in miniature, designed to look like a simple error, but unravel into chaos if handled incorrectly. He placed a folder not on top of the desk, but slightly askew in a secondary stack, a place that would require tidying, a place her meticulous nature couldn't ignore. The next morning, the folder was back in its pristine designated spot. Affixed to the cover was a small, crisp sticky note. In neat, precise handwriting, it read, "Corrected potential null pointer exception in the data validation array. My apologies for the presumption." No signature. It was the most elegant, understated checkmate he had ever witnessed. He said nothing to her. But from that day, he began to see everything. He noticed the way she had subtly adjusted the antique grandfather clock in the hall, correcting the 4 minutes it had been losing every week. He saw how the books in his personal library, once arranged by size, were now organized by historical period, then alphabetically by author. And then, a week later, he saw something that had nothing to do with logic. He saw her pause by the silver-framed photograph of his late mother on the console table. She didn't just dust it, she gently straightened it, her touch full of a quiet reverence that was both startling and deeply moving. She was supposed to be a ghost in his home, a functionary who kept the surfaces clean. But Julian was seeing her now, and the person coming into focus was not just a mind to be hired, but a character to be admired. Her intellect was a marvel, but her humility was a revelation. In a world that screamed for attention, Elara Finch was a whisper. Julian began to see that she didn't just hide her light. She seemed completely unaware she was shining. He found her once in an expansive laundry room, folding his precisely ironed shirts, humming a tune so soft it was almost just a breath. He had stood in the doorway for a full minute, watching her, completely unseen. There was a heartbreaking serenity in her quiet focus, the peaceful acceptance of someone who had long ago stopped waiting for an audience. That night, sitting alone in his glass-walled office, Julian stared at the garbled mess of the latest crash report from the Odyssey team. It was a digital car crash, a tangle of brute force patches and panicked comments from his senior developers. His mind kept returning to the memory of her code, to that single perfect function she had rewritten days ago. She had seen through a brick wall, while 10 of his best engineers were still looking for the door. And yet, that same intellect was currently somewhere in his home, scrubbing sinks and emptying trash. He leaned back, the leather of his chair groaning in the silence, and spoke the words to the empty room. That uniform is an insult to your intelligence. But he knew Elara would never be the one to take it off. If her life was going to change, the catalyst would have to be him. Julian Vance did not believe in luck or divine intervention. He believed in reproducible results. And the most extraordinary variable in his life was Elara. So he began a new, more rigorous experiment. Quietly, methodically, he continued to leave breadcrumbs. Elegant algorithmic problems disguised as forgotten notes, logical paradoxes left open on a tablet, encryption flaws buried deep in a printed report. They weren't easy. Each one was a step up in complexity, a challenge designed to probe the very limits of her knowledge. And every single time, without fail, she solved them. Each correction was a ghost's work, discovered the next morning with the same type of humble, pencil note in the margin. Possible resource leak here. Apologies if I'm mistaken. Or, this sequence might be more efficient. Just a thought. She never signed her name. She never claimed credit. She just fixed the broken things she found in his world. Julian stopped trying to convince himself it was a coincidence. He began working from the penthouse more, camouflaging his observations with excuses of remote summits and uninterrupted focus. In truth, his focus was entirely on her. He found himself anticipating the soft, deferential knock on a study door, the quiet way she would refill his water carafe without a word, with a quick, almost apologetic smile she offered before vanishing back into the silent halls. He, a man whose every minute was scheduled and monetized, began engineering small, inefficient moments just to interact with her. The archival printer is offline again, Elara. Or, could you find me a legal pad, the kind with the yellow paper? Or, this espresso machine is throwing error code I don't recognize. He, the architect of the digital age, was suddenly baffled by basic office equipment. She never questioned it. She would simply nod with quiet deference, step in, and somehow, the broken things would work again. One night, Julian sat bathed in the glow of his monitor, staring into the digital abyss of the Odyssey project's back-end instability. The report on his screen was a mess of conflicting theories. His lead engineers were convinced they were chasing corrupted modules, but their efforts were scattered, desperate. He heard Elara enter the study behind him, the soft whisper of her shoes on a rug, to dust a bookshelf in the far corner. He felt, more than saw, her pause behind him, Pretending to be engrossed, Julian didn't move a muscle. Then, her voice, so quiet he almost missed it. "I don't think the error is in the code." Julian looked up from his screen, his focus broken. "Excuse me?" She took a hesitant step closer, her hands clasped in front of her as if to keep from pointing. "The instability," she clarified. "I don't think it's a bug in the code itself. It's the architecture. It's how the data is being routed between the security module and the data cache." She paused, searching for the right words. "It's behaving like a highway where every car is pulled over for a full security check at every on-ramp. The cars are fine, the road is fine, but the protocol itself is creating its own gridlock." He stared at her. That exact hypothesis, a potential bottleneck in the routing protocol, had been raised and summarily dismissed by his senior architects in the first week. They had deemed it too simplistic and moved on to more complex, esoteric theories. Yet Elara had said it with a calm certainty that felt more grounded than a month's worth of his team's frantic reports. "Are you suggesting the latency is originating in the access permissions queue?" he asked, his tone shifting from employer to peer. She nodded, her confidence growing as she entered a world she understood. "Yes, the more layers of encryption you add, without restructuring priority of the verification calls, the more likely they are to stack in timeout. The system begins to DDoS itself. Essentially, it starts blocking its own progress to verify its own security." Julian turned fully in his chair to face her. "How do you know that?" A faint flush rose to her cheeks. "I designed a closed network for a university project once. It had the same issue. It kept freezing under load, and it took me a week of tearing my hair out to realize I was verifying every data packet twice. It's a mistake you only make once." Silence descended. Then, with a sudden, sharp movement, Julian swiveled back to his terminal. His fingers flew across the holographic keyboard, pulling up the primary diagnostic matrix and cross-referencing it with the security server's ping logs. And there it was, blazing on the screen in stark, undeniable data points. The system lag, the crashes, the corrupted packets. They correlated perfectly, down to the nanosecond, with the cryptographic security pings. She was right. An entire team of experts had been chasing ghosts for weeks, and the Maid had just pointed to the real killer. His jaw tightened, the muscle flexing in anger and awe. 3 weeks, he said, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. "My entire senior engineering division has been chasing shadows for 3 weeks." Elara recoiled slightly, as if she'd caused the problem herself. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything." "Stop," he cut in, standing slowly from his chair, the authority returning to his voice, but aimed at her apology, not her. "Stop apologizing for being right." She looked down, her hands twisting the edge of her apron. Julian let out a slow breath, a mixture of frustration and profound respect. "You just accomplished in 30 seconds what $1 million in salaries couldn't in a month." "I just saw the pattern," she whispered, deflecting the praise. "Seeing the pattern is one thing," he replied, his voice quieter now, more intense. "Having the courage to point it out matters more." Their eyes met across the dimly lit study, and in that charged silence, Julian finally understood. He hadn't underestimated her because she was invisible. He had underestimated her because his own preconceptions had made him blind. And now that he could truly see her, he found it impossible to look away. He waited until Friday. Elara had just finished her duties for the evening and was preparing to leave when he stepped into the hallway, holding 2 identical porcelain mugs of coffee. "Elara, do you have a moment?" he asked. She looked up, startled by the casual offer, but nodded. "Of course, Mr. Vance." He led her back into the study and gestured toward the plush leather chair opposite his own. She hesitated. The chair's seat of power she had only ever dusted, never occupied. Sitting down, she looked profoundly uncomfortable, a guest in a room she knew intimately. "I wanted to ask you something," he began, setting a mug down on the polished wood in front of her. "Something important." Elara shifted, her posture guarded. "Okay, I'd like you to consider a proposal. I want you to work with me. Not as a cleaner," he said, making the distinction clear. "As a technical consultant. Temporary at first. Flexible hours. You'd help me troubleshoot the very systems you already understand better than most of my division." She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "The coffee forgotten. You want me to work for you?" "You have been for weeks," Julian said, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "I'm merely proposing we correct the title. And the paycheck." Elara looked down at her hands, which were trembling slightly in her lap. "Mr. Vance, I'm incredibly flattered, but I can't." Her voice was barely audible. I'm not qualified. I never finished my degree, she whispered, the words an admission of defeat. I'm just Don't, he cut in, his voice firm but not harsh. A command bore respect, not anger. Don't you dare finish that sentence. That uniform is a costume you wear for survival. It is not who you are. She blinked, startled by his intensity. You have solved critical, multi-million-dollar errors. You've seen patterns that a team of seasoned experts missed, and you have never once asked for credit. In my world, that isn't just intelligence, Elara. That is character, and it is infinitely rarer. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. She stared down at her hands, folded so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. I won't pressure you, Julian added, his voice softening again. But the offer stands. When you're ready, it's yours. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. That night, he left a new file on his desk containing the raw data from a disastrous beta test. It wasn't a test anymore. It was a silent conversation. In the morning, the data was recompiled and the flaw in the test logic was corrected. A new, elegant function was scribbled in pencil on a blank page. He didn't say anything, and neither did she. An unspoken routine was born. At night, Elara, the ghost in his home, would quietly mend a brilliant, broken things no one else could fix. By morning, Julian would present the progress to his executive team, becoming the public face of her private genius. He shielded her identity not out of shame, but out of a fierce, burgeoning sense of protection. She wasn't ready to face his world, but he was willing to wait until she was. One morning, Elara entered the study to find the room empty, but on the corner of the great mahogany desk sat a small silver tray. On it was a fresh croissant, a bowl of fruit, and a glass of orange juice. Nothing extravagant, just thoughtful. Beside it was a note handwritten on his heavy personal letterhead. Geniuses also require fuel. Eat. A real smile, bright and unguarded, bloomed on her face, and for the first time in a long, long while, her hands trembled not from exhaustion, but from a warmth that started in her chest. Gratitude, and the faintest, most fragile shimmer of hope. She ate in the reverent silence of the morning study. That night, when she finished her work, she left a single yellow sticky note on the bezel of his laptop. Thank you. It was perfect. Julian found it when he returned late that night, long after she had gone. He peeled the note off carefully and stared at her neat, precise handwriting. Something shifted deep inside him. A final wall of clinical observation crumbling away. It wasn't what she wrote that mattered. It was that the ghost in his machine had finally written back. The tension in the boardroom was thick enough to taste a static charge of suspicion and impatience. Julian Vance stood at the head of the obsidian table, a lone pillar of calm amidst a storm of questioning gazes from his department heads and senior board members. The Odyssey project, the albatross that had been sinking their quarterly projections, was now soaring. It was stable, efficient, and weeks ahead of its revised schedule. But no one believed he was the one flying it. Julian, we're all grateful for the turnaround. Marcus Thorne, a senior board member, said, his arms folded across his chest. But the log show commits Maid from your personal terminal at 3 a.m. with a coding signature our architects have never seen. This isn't your style. So, who is the ghost in your machine? Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. I'm not comfortable discussing the specifics of a private contributor, Julian said evenly, his voice betraying none of his internal conflict. Let's focus on the results. We're a publicly traded company. Julian, not a fairy tale. Another director cut in sharply. We don't reward ghosts. We reward assets. We need to meet the person who saved this company from a catastrophic failure. Julian's jaw tightened. He thought of his promise to Elara, a silent vow to shield her until she was ready. But then he thought of the thundering injustice of it all, of her brilliance remaining a secret while these men debated its source. This was no longer about protection. It was about honor. After a long, strained silence, he gave a single, heavy nod. I'll arrange it. The next morning, Elara arrived at the gleaming cathedral of Vance Industries headquarters in her simple work uniform. Black slacks, a plain blue blouse. Her hair pulled back in its usual neat bun. Julian had called her in early, explaining that a VIP delegation was visiting, and the main atrium needed to be spotless before their arrival. She had no idea she was the delegation's main event. The company's main conference hall buzzed with the full force of its senior staff. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell as Julian strode onto stage. Good morning, he began, his voice amplified throughout the silent hall. Before we discuss projections and profits, I'm here to correct the official record. A wave of intrigue swept through the room. A few months ago, this company faced an existential threat. A core system failure on our flagship project was bleeding us dry. The official story is that management, myself included, steered us back on course. That story, he paused, letting the weight of his next word settle, is incomplete. Millions were spent, Julian continued, his voice resonating with the memory of his own frustration. Nothing worked. He let the admission of failure hang in the air. And then, when we were on the verge of collapse, a solution appeared. A fix so elegant, so flawless. It was like a miracle, but it didn't come from our labs. It didn't come from our senior architects. He turned and gestured to the back of the Great Hall. A single spotlight swung, finding a lone figure standing by the service entrance, frozen in its beam. Elara Finch, holding a cleaning bucket and a damp cloth. Elara, Julian's voice rang out warm and clear. Would you please join me on stage? She blinked, stunned, a deer caught in the blinding light of a world she was never meant to enter. 1,000 heads turned. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Slowly, hesitantly, as if walking in a dream, she set down her bucket and made her way down the long aisle. Julian met her at the steps, extending a hand to help her up. He turned back to the microphone, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder as if to steady her, and to ground himself. This, he announced, his voice filled with pride that silenced the entire room, is Elara Finch. By title, she is a member of our janitorial staff. In truth, she is the architect who saved our company. A profound, deafening silence fell over the hall. Then, from a front row, a single, slow clap from the company's oldest engineer. It was joined by another and another, until the room erupted into a thunderous, unanimous standing ovation. Elara stood beside Julian, her composure finally breaking as tears welled in her eyes. I didn't mean to. I was just... She began, her voice trembling. Julian gently handed her the microphone, not to speak, but just to hold. You don't need to explain anything, he murmured. Just let them see you. She shook her head, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. I never thought, she whispered into the mic, her voice cracking, I'd ever stand in a room like this again. Julian smiled softly, his voice for her, but picked up by the microphone all the same. That's because you never should have been asked to leave it. He looked at him, and in her expression was a universe of gratitude, of disbelief, of a future suddenly, violently rewritten. In that moment, the rigid caste system of the corporate world dissolved. The lines between a CEO and a cleaner, between a degree and a gift, blurred into nothing. The woman they had passed in the hallways without a glance was the reason those hallways still led to their offices. And the man who brought her into the light wasn't just their boss anymore. He was a leader. It had been a week since the day Elara's name echoed through the conference hall. Since then, her life had become a whirlwind. Her name, once a secret, was now a headline. Offers flooded in from rival tech giants, from prestigious universities offering to reinstate her scholarship, from venture capitalists wanting to fund whatever she dreamed of next. Everyone wanted a piece of the quiet genius who had single-handedly rescued a $200 million project from the brink of oblivion. But Elara remained a quiet eye in the center of her own hurricane, continuing her new duties, deflecting the spotlight as best she could until Julian called her into his office one afternoon. MIT reached out, he said, his tone professional but kind. He slid a thick, cream-colored envelope across the polished desk. The university's crest was embossed in the corner. They're offering a full reinstatement of your scholarship. Elara stared at the letter, a ghost from a past life. They'll even grant you full credit for your prior work, he added gently. You could have your degree in less than 2 years. A faint, bittersweet smile touched her lips, but her eyes were clouded with an immediate, painful hesitation. I can't go back, Julian, she said softly. Why not? He asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. My mother, she replied, her voice steady with the weight of her conviction. She's stable, but she's not well. If I leave the city, there's no one. I made a promise to myself that I would never leave her again. Julian studied her for a long moment, seeing the unbreakable resolve in her gaze. He didn't argue. He didn't try to engineer a solution. He simply gave a nod of understanding. Okay. She looked at him, surprised by the lack of pressure. Okay, he repeated. I understand, but know the door is always open. She left his office with the letter, a tangible symbol of a dream she'd buried and a duty she would never abandon. 2 weeks later, a call from the residential care facility shattered her quiet routine. "Just want to let you know, Ms. Finch, your mother's new specialist, a top neurologist from the University Hospital, is starting this afternoon," the head nurse said cheerfully. "Also, the agency has assigned a full-time private care nurse to her suite. Everything is fully covered." Elara froze, the phone cold against her ear. "What? I didn't arrange any of that." "It's all taken care of," the nurse replied. "Some sort of anonymous benefactor program. It's wonderful." That night, Elara sat beside her mother's bed. The lines of chronic pain etched around her mother's eyes had softened. For the first time in a decade, she looked truly at peace, breathing the easy, untroubled sleep of the cared for. And Elara knew there was only one person in her orbit with the power and the precision to solve an impossible problem so completely, so silently. The next day, she walked past Julian's executive assistant without breaking stride and pushed open the heavy doors to the office. He looked up from his work, his expression shifting from surprise to understanding as he saw the fire in her eyes. "It was you," she said, her voice tight with a storm of emotions. "My mother's care." He didn't deny it, didn't even flinch. "Your mother deserves the best care available," he stated, as if discussing a market forecast. That was a variable that needed to be eliminated. Her voice cracked. "You should have asked me." He rose from his chair and walked around the desk to stand before her, his presence calm but unyielding. "Elara," he said, his voice low and steady, "would your pride have allowed you to say yes?" She flinched as if struck by the truth of his question. Her hands, clenched at her sides, began to tremble. She swallowed hard, her hands shaking from the emotional onslaught. "Why?" she whispered, the question encompassing everything: the job, her mother's care, his unwavering belief. "Why are you doing all of this?" "Because you deserve a life, Elara. A real one," he said, his voice low and steady, a firm anchor in her storm. "Not just a life of surviving, of hiding your gifts. A life of thriving." He hesitated, then took a small step closer, his gaze intense. "And selfishly? Because the world has been deprived of your talent for too long, and I want a front row seat to see what you build with it." Tears welled, blurring his image. She had spent years making herself invisible, proving her worth in silent, thankless acts, expecting no notice, no praise. And now, this powerful, brilliant man was not just seeing her, he was clearing a path for her. Later that evening, Elara returned to her small apartment to find a sleek, matte black box on her kitchen table. Inside, nestled in custom-fit foam, was an elegant, state-of-the-art laptop, thin and powerful. It wasn't just a machine, it was an invitation. A key. On its smooth, cool surface was a single, folded note in its sharp, neat script. The first keyboard in history to generate a $200 million return on investment. "I believe it belongs to its operator." A choked sob escaped her, followed by a watery smile. The tears that slid silently down her cheeks were not of sorrow, but of release. It was the melting of a glacier of responsibility she had carried for years. She was finally free. The auditorium shimmered beneath a canopy of gold and silver lights, casting a warm glow over a sea of elegantly dressed guests. It was the innovators of the future gala, the most prestigious night in the tech world. Tucked quietly in the back row, almost invisible in the grandeur, sat Elara Finch. She wore a midnight blue gown, simple and timeless. Her blonde hair was pinned back in a soft twist, revealing a face both nervous and luminous. She looked less like an industry icon, and more like someone who had wandered into the wrong room. But Julian, seated beside her, knew better. He had never been more certain that she belonged anywhere she chose to be. She hadn't prepared a speech. The nomination alone was a miracle she would let pass without expectation. And then the presenter opened the final, gleaming envelope of the night. The award for most influential young innovator of the year goes to... A pause, a practiced smile. Elara Finch. The room hushed for a heartbeat, as if the air itself was stunned. Elara sat perfectly still, her breath caught in her throat. She didn't move until Julian reached over and gently squeezed her hand. "Go," he whispered, his voice low and certain. "This moment is yours." As the audience erupted into a wave of warm applause, she made her way down the long, carpeted aisle. Each step was a pilgrimage from the past to the present, echoing with memories of floors once mopped and code once written in the secret stillness of the night. When she reached the stage, she stood at the podium, a look on her face that hovered between awe and disbelief. "I never thought I'd be standing here," Elara began, her voice fragile but unwavering. "For years I hid, behind mop handles, behind excuses, behind fear. I used to believe that brilliance needed a title or a degree to be seen. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. But brilliance, I've learned, rarely grows in isolation, she added, her voice thick with gratitude. It needs to be seen. Someone saw the potential in me before I saw it in myself. Someone believed I belonged in the light, even when I wasn't ready to step into it. She glanced toward Julian, wanting to share the moment, and for a second, her heart stopped. He wasn't in the audience. He was walking onto the stage. Dressed in a classic black tuxedo, Julian Vance moved with a quiet, undeniable confidence, one hand held behind his back. The crowd murmured in confusion as he approached the podium. Elara blinked, completely bewildered. "Julian," she said softly. He stood beside her. His smile meant only for her. "You saved our systems," he said, his voice a low, intimate counterpoint to the vastness of the hall. "You saved this company. You've saved jobs and futures and an entire legacy." He paused, his expression shifting into something deeper, more vulnerable. "But you did more than that, Elara. You saved me." He brought his hand from behind his back, revealing a small, dark velvet box. "You didn't just debug a system," he said, his thumb flicking the box open. The soft, brilliant fire of a diamond caught the stage lights. "You rewrote my source code. You fixed something in me I didn't even know was broken. A collective." Silent gasps swept through the room. "Elara Finch," Julian said, his voice clear and unwavering, filled with an emotion the world had never heard from him. "Will you build a future with me?" Elara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as tears finally sprang free, the world around her dissolving into a blur of light and sound. She could only see him. She could only nod, over and over, a silent, tearful confirmation before she finally managed to whisper the one word that mattered. "Yes!" The audience rose to its feet in a single, thunderous motion as Julian slipped the perfect, shining ring onto her trembling finger. Forgetting the stage, the crowd, the entire world, she threw her arms around his neck, laughing and crying all at once. In that moment, beneath the glare of 1,000 lights, they created their own quiet universe. There was no company, no gala, just a girl who once swept the floors, and a man who had always seen her shining. The next morning, the headlines weren't just about the innovator of the year. They were about the merger of a lifetime. If you felt a connection with this story, we invite you to join us here at Stories for You. A simple like, share, or subscription helps us bring more tales like this to the world. Our promise is to share stories that celebrate the quiet strength in all of us. Until our next story, remember that the most powerful chapters often begin with a single act of courage.